Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Mabel Young was born in 1869 in Boston, the only child of Mr. Charles H. Young and his wife. Her father sadly passed away during her early childhood, so Mabel and her mother moved in with her maternal grandfather, Mr. James W. Hobbs, a very respectable gentleman who before retirement had worked as an importer. They lived in an elegant house on Chester Park, one of Boston's most fashionable neighbourhoods. The Hobbs family had for a long time enjoyed a prominent social standing, residing in a part of the city known for its wealth and refinement. At the time, Boston was one of the major centres of education in America. The city was home to many prestigious institutions, including Harvard University, and a robust public school system that emphasized reading, writing, and religious instruction. Church was a central part of life for many families, and Sunday school was an important weekly ritual for children like Mabel, where they would learn biblical teachings and moral lessons. On the afternoon of the 23rd of May 1875, Mabel was taken by her aunt, a lady named Miss Augusta Hobbs, to the Warren Street Baptist Church for Sunday school, something that she did on most Sundays. Miss Hobbs would leave the child, and while Mabel was in class, she would run a few errands, or spend the time chatting with other church members. The class ended at 3:30, and Miss Hobbs returned to collect her niece. When she arrived at the church, she spoke to the Reverend, but when the conversation finished, she could not find Mabel. Miss Hobbs initially assumed that the young girl was playing with a friend. However, after several minutes without any sign of her niece, she grew concerned. She called out Mabel's name and began searching around the church. A few other ladies joined in, but they were unable to locate the little girl. Miss Hobbs, now sensing that something was wrong, grew increasingly more frantic. More people began to help look for Mabel, yet there was still no trace of the child. Around 4 p.m, things took a decisive turn when one of the teachers named Walter Sawyer took the lead. A few people who had been outside the church had reported that they heard a child scream coming from the belfry. They said that the screams only lasted for a few seconds, and then everything went silent. Mr. Sawyer made his way upstairs towards the gallery door, accompanied by the church sexton, a 28-year-old man named Thomas Piper. As they reached the door, they found it locked, but both men could hear faint moans coming from the belfry. Alarmed, Mr. Sawyer turned to Mr. Piper and asked for the key to unlock the door. However, Mr. Piper, looking quite uneasy, responded that he did not know where the key was. He explained that even though he was a sexton, he hadn't been into the belfry since the previous fall and wasn't sure where the key might be stored. Nevertheless, he assured him that he would look for it. He then disappeared to look for the key. When he returned, he said that he had not been able to find it. By this point, Mr. Sawyer had grown impatient. The muffled sounds were still coming from the belfry, so determined to get inside, he reached into his pockets, pulled out a pair of pliers, and after a few moments, he had managed to unlock the door and climb through the narrow flight of stairs that led to the belfry. At the top, he opened the hatch, and just as a flock of pigeons who had been startled by the intrusion flew out, he saw that in front of him lay little Mabel. Her head was covered in blood, but she was still alive. Beside her there was a baseball bat, which was smeared with both whitewash and blood. Mr. Sawyer bent down and gently lifted her. Then, with great care, he carried the child down the stairs and back into the church. He lay her in the nave, and Miss Hobbs and other parishioners rushed to attend her. The police and a doctor had already been contacted and arrived soon after. Officers immediately started to investigate who could have committed this terrible act. Little Mabel Young was unconscious and was receiving medical treatment, but she was in a very bad way, and it was unclear if she would even survive the night. As the officers began their investigation, it quickly became apparent that the church sexton, Mr. Thomas Piper, had been behaving in a particularly suspicious manner. Witnesses reported that he had been seen lingering around the church at odd hours and engaging in unsettling conversations with parishioners. Despite these concerns, when he was briefly questioned by the police, he confidently claimed that he hadn't set foot in the church belfry for the past 6 months. The bat used in the attack on Mabel quickly became the focal point of the investigation. Deacon George L. Norris, a regular churchgoer who resided at 360 Main Street in Charlestown, informed the police that he had seen the bat in the church library between 10 and 11 o'clock that morning. He said that he had been intrigued that it was in such an odd location, so asked one of the Sunday school students why it was there and who it belonged to. What made this particularly strange was that the bat had somehow found its way up to the belfry, the place where Mabel was found. The police were growing more suspicious and became increasingly focused on learning more about the church sexton, whose actions and involvement in the case were becoming increasingly suspicious. He was already known to them, having previously been a suspect in the murder of Bridget Landrigan, a young woman killed on the night of December the 5th, 1873, in the Dorchester area of Boston. Miss Landrigan had been struck on the head with a heavy object, and a man had been seen climbing over the fence near the railroad tracks. While no positive identification was made, the man's age and height closely matched that of Mr. Thomas Piper. Several individuals were arrested in connection with the murder, including Mr. Piper, but all were released due to lack of evidence, and by May 1875, the case remained unsolved. As news of the attack on Mabel Young spread, quite a large crowd gathered outside the church. The police, however, would not allow them to enter and continued to interview witnesses, most of who wanted to speak about the church sexton, Mr. Piper. A lady named Mrs. Norris, who was the wife of the deacon, told them that Mr. Piper often appeared troubled, as though something was bothering him. Another parishioner, Mr. W.H. Gleason, who owned a shop at 510 Shawmut Avenue, informed them that just days earlier, Mr. Piper had come into his store and sold him 6 pigeons for $2.10. He added that when he asked where the pigeons came from, Mr. Piper had casually replied, "Oh, I raised them in the church belfry." This struck the police as particularly odd, since Mr. Piper had claimed that he hadn't been in the belfry since the previous fall. As the police continued interviewing local church members, more unsettling details about Mr. Piper's behaviour began to surface. Rumours circulated that he had a troubling habit of enticing children into the church under unclear and suspicious circumstances, and this raised further concerns about his intentions. When officers had questioned Mr. Piper, they had immediately noticed bloodstains on both his collar and his handkerchief, and during a search of his room, Detective Dearborn had made a troubling discovery, a container filled with a mixture of whiskey and laudanum. When asked why he had such a combination, Mr. Piper had calmly explained that he used it to help him sleep at night. He also told officers that he had spoken with Mabel Young on the Sunday afternoon, but claimed that he had simply asked her if she liked Sunday school. However, his demeanour, combined with these revelations, only deepened the officers' suspicions about him. As the investigation progressed, it was discovered that the infant class that Mabel attended had been dismissed earlier than the more advanced classes, which were held in a room directly across from the younger children's. After the students had left, witnesses reported seeing Mr. Piper at the door of the older children's classroom, and one gentleman who recalled approaching him said that Mr. Piper appeared startled and oddly asked if the seats were satisfactory, an unusual inquiry given that he rarely visited the room and had no reason to be concerned with the seating. For several minutes following this encounter, Mr. Piper's whereabouts were unaccounted for, leading officers to suspect that this was when he may have taken 5-year-old Mabel Young to the belfry. With the mounting evidence against him, Mr. Piper was promptly arrested and placed in a cell at the basement of City Hall as the police intensified their investigation. Later that evening, at 7:40 p.m, tragic news arrived. Mabel Young had succumbed to her injuries without ever regaining consciousness. Her death cast a shadow over the case and heightened the public outcry and the pressure on the authorities to find the perpetrator of this terrible crime. When officers informed Mr. Piper of the young girl's death, he became agitated. He retreated to the corner of his cell, and his initial cooperative manner suddenly changed. Now, whenever officers approached him, he responded in a stubborn and evasive manner, offering only abrupt and unhelpful answers. His agitation was a stark contrast to the calm composure he had previously displayed. Police Chief Edward Savage, was now convinced that the evidence against Mr. Piper was strong enough to secure a conviction. The bloodstains on his clothing, his evasive behaviour, and the growing testimonies from the witnesses had all pointed to his involvement in the crime. He ordered an official inquest into Mabel Young's death and suggested that it started immediately. At the inquest, several witnesses provided compelling testimony. Some stated that they had spotted the baseball bat earlier that day, positioned behind the library door. Officers also noted that when Mr. Piper was apprehended, he in fact possessed 2 sets of keys, which opened a total of 14 doors within the church, including the one leading to the belfry. Adding to the intrigue, a boy who had been outside the church also said that he had seen a man jump from the belfry and run off. A young girl named Florence Leyland, who was from a respectable family in the neighbourhood, recounted to the court that she had previously complained to her parents about Mr. Piper inviting her to the belfry to see the pigeons. Another child, who was the daughter of Reverend William Wright, said that on many occasions she had told her mother that she thought Mr. Piper was a bad man and that she was afraid of him. The inquest was informed that other parents also reported their daughters had made similar complaints about Mr. Piper. On Tuesday, the 8th of June 1875, the inquest concluded with a verdict that 5-year-old Mabel Young had been murdered by Thomas Piper. Following this verdict, he was placed in prison to await his trial. The trial of Thomas Piper began on Monday the 6th of December 1875 and was a sensational event, drawing widespread attention from both the press and the public. Headlines filled local newspapers, mirroring the community's growing fear and intrigue. Not only did the proceedings raise serious concerns about child safety, but they also revealed the public's morbid fascination with death. Mr. Piper showed no signs of nervousness, appearing completely unfazed by the proceedings. His calm and confident demeanour left a lasting impression in the courtroom. On the 3rd day of the trial, the prosecution presented around a dozen young girls, all of who were prepared to testify that Mr. Piper had invited them into the belfry on multiple occasions. However, after objections from the defence, the judge ruled their testimony inadmissible. Though much of the case relied on circumstantial evidence, the details were compelling. Dr. Joshua Treadwell took the stand and testified that he had examined a light-coloured hair found on Mr. Piper's coat and compared it to 50 hairs known to have come from Mabel Young's head. Dr. Treadwell confidently stated that the hair on Mr. Piper's coat once belonged to Mabel Young. He also said that he had discovered bloodstains in various spots on Mr. Piper's clothing. Further testimony came from William Barry and Frederick Glover, who both claimed that sometime between 3:30 and 4 p.m. on the 23rd of May, they saw a man who they later identified to be Thomas Piper jumping from a window in the belfry of the Warren Avenue Baptist Church and running towards the back of it. Mr. Glover added that Mr. Piper was not wearing a hat and stumbled as he ran. While this seemed like damning evidence, its impact was somewhat undermined when, during cross-examination, Mr. Glover admitted to having a criminal record, including time in prison for forgery. Witnesses were only allowed in the courtroom during their testimony, which ensured that the trial was conducted with strict impartiality. However, as more people took the stand, the community's belief in Mr. Piper's guilt steadily increased. After 9 days, the trial drew to a close. Mr. Avery, representing the defence, made a persuasive argument against the circumstantial evidence presented by the prosecution. He asserted that Mr. Glover, the witness who claimed to have seen Mr. Piper jump from the window in the belfry, should himself face charges for the same murder. Mr. Avery highlighted Mr. Glover's suspicious actions on the 23rd of May, including his disposal of the trousers and the other clothing that he had worn, as well as his decision to tear out the pockets of his coat, which could have been used to conceal hands that were covered in blood. Mr. Avery also pointed out to the jury that there were only 3 minutes unaccounted for in Mr. Piper's timeline during which he could have committed the crime. He argued that it was far more plausible to conclude that the little girl was accidentally injured by a falling object, and it was difficult to believe that Mr. Piper had meticulously planned her murder, days in advance, without any apparent motive. The jury deliberated for 20 hours before returning. When they did, they informed the judge that they were unable to agree on a verdict. 9 jury members were in favour of conviction and 3 for acquittal. This division meant that Mr. Piper could not be declared either innocent or guilty, and there would have to be a second trial in order to reach a conclusive decision regarding his fate. The second trial began on the 31st of January 1876, and the same witnesses were called to give testimony. However, some previously excluded evidence was introduced, adding a new dimension to the case. Thomas Piper was granted the chance to address the jury, and when he did, he spoke in a manner that was both humble and courteous. His tone was calm and respectful as he carefully expressed his thoughts. He firmly maintained that he was innocent of the charges brought against him, pleading with the jury to consider his words and the evidence carefully. He explained that he had been wrongfully accused and emphasised that he had no involvement in the terrible crime. His polite and composed appearance contrasted with the seriousness of the accusations, making his appeal one of quiet conviction rather than an emotional outburst. Despite this, on Tuesday the 8th of February 1876, Thomas Piper was found guilty of the murder of 5-year-old Mabel Young, and the judge sentenced him to death. The defence lodged an appeal, but it was ultimately denied. In the wake of this setback, Mr. Piper delivered a bizarre and seemingly implausible account of how Mabel Young had met her tragic end. He claimed that he had invited her into the belfry to see the pigeons, and in an attempt to let in some fresh air, he propped open a window with the bats. After stepping away for just a moment, he returned to find that the trapdoor had fallen and struck Mabel on the head. Panic-stricken and fearful of being blamed for the accident, he left the child in the belfry and remained silent out of fear. This story, however, was met with widespread scepticism. In a dramatic twist, just 2 weeks before his scheduled execution, Thomas Piper confessed to the murder of 5-year-old Mabel Young. He also revealed his involvement in other violent attacks. He disclosed to officers that he had in fact murdered Bridget Landrigan on the night of December the 5th, 1873, a crime in which he had been a suspect but was never charged. He also told of how he attacked Mary Tyner, a prostitute who sustained serious injuries in 1874. He admitted that he had been drinking with her before going to her home. He said that after falling asleep, he suddenly awoke in the middle of the night and for some reason seized a hammer-like object and struck her multiple times. He said that following the assault, he exited through a window and returned to the church, where he slept for the remainder of the night. Though Miss Tyner survived the attack, she was not able to identify her assailant, and due to her injuries, had been transferred to spend the rest of her days in a lunatic asylum, and the case had remained unsolved. However, his confession did not stop there. He also admitted to assaulting a young woman named Minnie Sullivan on December the 29th, 1871. He said that in this attack he struck her with a blunt object, but her screams frightened him, so he fled the scene. Although Miss Sullivan was left both injured and traumatised, she eventually managed to recover from her ordeal, but no one had ever been charged for the attack. Despite the seriousness of these omissions, there was insufficient evidence to charge him for any of these crimes. Ultimately, Thomas Piper was only convicted for the murder of Mabel Young. On the 26th of May 1876, he was executed by hanging alongside another condemned man named Samuel J. Frost, who was known as the Petersham Murderer. After his death, Thomas Piper was privately buried at the Mount Hope Cemetery. His family made a heartfelt request for his complete written confessions, which contained explicit details of his numerous crimes, to remain private and not be disclosed to the public. Sheriff John Clark took the request seriously and ultimately agreed, reasoning that most of Mr. Piper's heinous acts were already widely known. He believed that releasing the full confession would serve no purpose other than to further traumatise the community and amplify the dark legacy that Thomas Piper had left behind. By keeping the confession away from the press, Sheriff Clark aimed to spare the public from additional horrors and preserve some dignity for the victims and their families. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.